Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Hope you've got a good cup of coffee and are somewhere comfortable. Just a couple of things that I'll mention before we get into the meat of our discussion today. November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day. This is the date on which the armistice was signed that ended the fighting in World War I. I think it was 11 o'clock on November the 11th. This same day later became celebrated in the U.S. and is celebrated in the U.S. as Veterans Day. So if you know a veteran, thank them for their service. But for today, I wanted to finish what I began really talking about during the sermon on Sunday. This past Sunday, the lectionary text was from 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18, which opens up this whole big can of worms that is sometimes referred to as the rapture. And I didn't want to chase that rabbit real far in the sermon Sunday, so I figured that I'll chase the rabbit a little bit this morning, spell out what many people understand by that term, and also sort of where I come down, what I believe on that. One thing to point out with this, any discussion about the end of time, as you might call it, or Christ's return, is we need to exercise a fair amount of grace in how we approach other people. This is not an area where we can afford to be particularly dogmatic, because there are scads of different views of exactly how the end of the age will play out. There are a lot of different views, all held by people who are serious students of Scripture, so this isn't something we can afford to be too doctrinal about. So, let me reread the passage that I read Sunday, and then I'll delve into it. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore encourage one another with these words. Now, that was the lectionary passage, lectionary epistle reading for this past Sunday. And this passage is the basis from which people who believe in a rapture of the church get their belief. So here in a nutshell is what is commonly understood, particularly in American evangelical circles. I'll try to spell it out, and then I'll give you my critique of it and sort of my own opinion. This passage is where people get the idea of a rapture of the church, and this is the sort of the idea that is expressed in the Left Behind books that were so popular 25 years ago. A couple of different movies by that title. And what it amounts to is this, that there will be really two different comings of the Lord. One that is secret, and then 7 years later, another one that is very public and glorious. So what believers in this find in 1 Thessalonians 4 is a secret return. Christ coming in secret, and believers are snatched up to be with Christ in the air. And after that, after they are snatched up, there is 7 years of awful tribulation on earth, and then at the end of 7 years of tribulation, Christ returns at the head of all of these saints, comes back to earth, at which point there's he will reign with them for 1,000 years on the earth. Normally they would hold that to be a literal 1,000-year reign. This is here again is how this plays out. Human history is going along till Christ comes, and this is secret. Poof, we're gone. Believers are gone. They are raptured up. They're caught up to be with Christ in the air, and only non-believers are left on the earth. And there's all grades of hell on earth and tribulation, and all of that stuff that you can find described so vividly in Revelation. And then at the end of that, which most hold to be 7 years, Christ returns again in glory. So my critique of this, this actually is a very modern interpretation of Scripture. It's a very modern one. This idea of a sort of a secret rapture, secret return of Christ is only goes back to the early 1800s. It's something that St. Augustine or Calvin or Luther or Wesley or anybody else before 1800 would never have heard of. It's very new. Apparently was originated by an Irish minister, John Nelson Darby, and Darby's viewpoint, which he began espousing in some writings and sermons, was picked up by Scofield, Cyrus Scofield, who edited the Scofield Study Bible. In fact, I've got one of those animals. That was picked up by Cyrus Scofield when he was doing his study Bible near the end of the 1800s, and from there it became very, very popular in American Protestant evangelical circles and remains popular to this day. This was the viewpoint that became the genesis for the book The Late Great Planet Earth back in the turmoil of the 1960s, and like I said, it's played out in the Left Behind series of books and movies. So now my critique of this is this. The fact that it's a fairly modern doctrine, a fairly modern understanding, doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. My critique of it isn't based on the fact that it's a fairly new way of looking at Scripture, but rather with the substance itself. For me, the great weakness of this view of looking at the end of time or Christ's return is you have to look really, really hard to find it. One can read entirely through the New Testament and never come up with this particular system and this particular way of looking at the end of the age. Just a straightforward read through the New Testament and you won't find it. Only if you already have a framework in mind. You have a pretty complex framework in mind of connecting portions of Daniel with Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians 4 and Revelation. Only if you've already got a pretty complex chart, with all lines and graphs going all over the place between those areas in the Bible, can you come up with this. And that to me is the greatest weakness of it. What I tend to say is that I believed in a pre-tribulational rapture. I did. And what I'd like to say is that I believed in it until I read the New Testament for myself. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm going to look down at those who would disagree with me on it. There are good Christians who do, and that's fine. This is definitely an area where we can agree to disagree. But for me, when I read the New Testament, I don't see it there. So, what do I believe? When I read 1 Thessalonians 4, the emphasis in this passage at the end of chapter 4 in 1 Thessalonians is really on the dead. Paul is writing to address a real question about the dead. These Thessalonians, they're primarily a Gentile church. They don't have a Jewish notion of the day of the Lord. They don't have the Jewish understanding of resurrection. And they're wondering about their dead. Like I said Sunday during the sermon, what happened to Cousin Joe and Aunt Susie? Did they miss out on Christ's return? Some people believe that the coming of Christ was going to be so imminent that none of the saints were going to die before he came back. And so Paul writes really to address this question about the dead. And what he tells them is, don't worry. When the dead are going to rise first. When Christ returns, the dead are going to rise first. And we'll all be together with the Lord. The dead have not missed anything. Cousin Joe and Aunt Susie and Grandma Margaret and all the rest of these saints you've just buried have not missed anything. And as I said Sunday, they haven't missed anything. Instead, they're first in line for the party. So my way of looking at this is that 1 Thessalonians 4 describes the resurrection of the dead. It describes the coming of Christ in glory and the resurrection of the dead, and is very similar, if you look at it that way, it's very similar to what you see described near the end of Revelation. This is the straightforward reading of this passage and of the New Testament to me. The term meet, and so to meet the Lord in the air, that is a term that is significant. The Greek word there that is translated as meet was used in the first century to refer to a delegation that's going out from a city to meet a returning king and escort him back inside the city. So that's a good way. That's a good way to look at it. Christ is the returning king, the returning dignitary, and we are going to meet Christ to return him back to the earth. And our hope as Christians is not disembodied souls somewhere out yonder. Our hope as Christians is on earth. Read the end of Revelation, and we have this beautiful picture of heaven coming to earth. Heaven comes to earth, and all of creation is remade, and that includes our frail, broken bodies. They're remade into something that is imperishable and incorruptible. So that's how I look at it. I don't believe in a rapture before the tribulation, because Jesus said in the Upper Room Discourse that his church, his followers would be persecuted, go through tribulation. I would like to be wrong. I'd very much like to be wrong. I'd like to think that I'd be beamed up before any sort of terrible hell on earth began, but when I read the scripture, I don't see it there. I don't believe in a pre-tribulational rapture. I believe that what we see in 1 Thessalonians 4 is another way of looking at the event that's described at the end of Revelation, which is the return of Christ in glory. 1 Thessalonians 4, the shout of command from the archangel and the trumpet of God, that's not the sort of thing that is going to be missed. That's big. That doesn't describe believers just vanishing. That describes something like God descending on top of Mount Sinai. That's my way of looking at the scripture, and like I said, this is something where we have to try to avoid being too doctrinal about it, because there are a gazillion different ways of looking at eschatology, the fancy word for the end of the age. So anyway, that's my way of looking at things, and I hope that you have a great rest of your Wednesday. And if you have other questions or thoughts about this topic, give me a call, shoot me a message. Have a great Wednesday.